are right on time, only 30 minutes late. So good afternoon, everybody. Usually when I have microphones, there are people making noise around me with guitars and drums, but okay, it's fine. Thank you, everybody. Welcome, karibuni sana. We appreciate your company. Thank you for your participation to the book launch of that wonderful book, Thinking Africa with Mudimbe, co-published with Twaweza, which is a Kenyan publisher. Twaweza, we can make it happen, is it? So yes, we did. As publisher, Twaweza and IFRA, yes, they did. As an editorial team, wonderful team, I could say, Salim Abdelmajid, Mariot Fouere, which is here, Maïline Lolé. Yes, they did, the wonderful authors. So thanks a lot for this collective work and this wonderful achievement. Thanks to Twaweza team, IFRA Africa team, and I would say a special big up to Rosbel, our colleagues, which is here because she, we can say that event today is one of her achievements, and we could clap for her because she has been very much committed, and we can see the very impressive results. So thanks to all the panelists, the different chairs from different backgrounds. So it's a wonderful collection of different people, and I assume good people. So we are going to have a very good afternoon. So my name is Sylvain Racco. I'm a geographer. I'm the IFRA director. So I have to confess, I'm not a specialist at all about Mudimbe. So I would have a very brief speech, which deal mostly with institutional and protocol issues. I would stress on the importance of co-publishing, of sharing different experience and achieving relevant objectives collectively. So what is IFRA? For those who knows, maybe there are. For those who do not know very much, the French Institute of Research in Africa. So IFRA promotes research in all disciplines of social and human science, let's say geography, political science, anthropology, history, and of course, literature. So our objective is to disseminate knowledge, to promote research, and also to promote our own publication. I'm also here to do our own promotion. So IFRA is a publisher as well. So we have books available online on free access on our collection, which is Africae. So it's available on free access, and we are also publishing an East African journal, scientific journal, which is called East African Review, Les Cahiers d'Afrique de l'Est. And we are also publishing some working paper, Mambo. So I invite you guys and your network to submit some contribution. We have also a unique library, which is the next room, which provide more than 16,000 books, scientific books dealing with the social and human sciences. So co-publishing is a way to address one of Mudimbe's main interests. His work places the tragedy of domination. This work is a part of one of the IFRA's research axes, which is decolonizing knowledge. So this research team is concerned with the context, conditions, and actors of the production and the use of knowledge in social science, philosophy, related to East Africa. So that result we are going to discuss today is a result of a project hosted and organized by IFRA, which was notably an international colloquium, Rethinking Africa with Mudimbe. This project has been organized by IFRA, the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies of the University of Nairobi, and Alliance Française. I'm going to conclude because I had some paragraph, some text about Mudimbe, but as we are not in advance, and I assume you know all of us very much Mudimbe, I will just conclude to say that why this book is important for our institute. Paradoxically, before the recent translation of his book L'Invention de l'Afrique, Mudimbe was little known in the French-speaking world, despite the fact that he taught draws on French-speaking intellectual tradition. So this is a way for me to announce we hope there will be a way forward about this book. So we expect to have a translation in French to expose this work to the French-speaking world. So thank you so much. We are going to enjoy this afternoon, and please allow me to call Kimani Njogu for a kind of introduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director, for the opportunity, and good afternoon, colleagues.
Good afternoon.
May I ask that we stand for just a minute in honor of Professor Mudimbe. I think we can sit. As many of you know, Professor Mudimbe passed on the 22nd of April. And he had been unwell for some time. So it is really coincidental that we are launching this book just about 3 weeks after his transitioning. So for Twaweza Communications, this is even more special because Mudimbe visited us about a decade ago, and we had time in our boardroom to speak about some of the ideas that he was advancing, and he has been advancing for some time. And consequently, after the meeting, he edited a volume on recontextualizing self and other issues in Africa. Earlier, I had edited a book on media and identity in Africa, and he wrote an epilogue in that book. So Mudimbe is very special, and I think there's going to be a lot of conversation around why he is special. For Twaweza Communications, we have had a very strong relationship with IFRA in terms of co-publishing, a relationship that has ensured that we make knowledge that would otherwise not be available. So we produce, we disseminate knowledge, and because we're not publishing commercially, the books that we produce would not be taken by the commercial publishers. So it's very, very special. I think this is really the way to go, as the director has said. We build partnerships to co-publish and release books that would otherwise not be picked by the commercial publishers. And that means then that we are, making knowledge available to the larger world. Twaweza, we are committed to knowledge production, knowledge dissemination. We run a podcast called Africa Speaking, which takes an African perspective to global issues. So the podcast does that. We are committed to issues of heritage and, really retrieving knowledge that is getting lost and so on. And as an arts, culture, and media institution, we also do the journal, Jahazi Arts, Culture, and Media, and many of the people in the room have contributed in the journal. And we will be releasing another issue this year in honor of one of the foremost visual artists in Kenya. So we are producing and disseminating knowledge, and today is part of that journey. So I really want to welcome you to this experience, and to really have that moment of reflection together. I want to pass the baton back to the director so that he can bring in the first panel. Director, can you do that? Sylvian? Yeah. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you.
Right, thank you. But if you allow me to invite straight, because we need time now.
Yes.
To address the core of the discussion. So please, I would invite Joyce. Joyce, please, could you come as you are the chair of that panel? And would you like to introduce your panelists?
Sure.
Yes, thank you so much.
So good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
I have, the privilege of inviting two people who are deeply involved in this book. One of them is Marie, who edited. Yeah, please come forward, Marie. And I hope that we're going to listen very keenly because I believe Marie has some secrets to how to get a book done. Yeah, Marie, welcome. And Alex Wanjala contributed a chapter to this volume. So it's great that he's here to tell us about that chapter. I want to start just by congratulating all of you who are involved in this project, including Twaweza and IFRA. As we know, the production of knowledge in the world that we live in today is a really, really difficult and painful thing because you have to tear yourself away from so many other exciting things that happen in clips of 1 minute, which are easier to enjoy. But here you are trying to dig into 1,000, 3,000 words. So congratulations, everybody, on this wonderful volume. And as Kemani just pointed out, how timely that this book should come out 3 weeks after the passing of this amazing sage, Mudimbe. I think the other small context to this book that occurred to me as I tried to dig into it is that this is a book conceived in one period. These days I like to divide the world before COVID and after COVID. But this is a book that was conceived BC, before COVID. And here we are today. So I'm going to ask Marie as she talks to us about, because I really want to hear this, where did this idea of thinking with Mudimbe come from, and how have we gotten to this moment, and taking cognizance of the fact that this was before COVID, and now we're here after COVID with this book. Yeah. So if you could give us just that journey, the writing of this book.
Thank you so much, Joyce. So first there was what I want to start with is this title, Thinking Africa with Mudimbe, because of course the main idea is to think with his work, with his thinking, with the concept he's brought, with the kind of question he's asked, and even with the type of research tools. I'm saying research tools, even though he works with text. But at the same time, in our mind, thinking Africa with Mudimbe was to be able to have a conversation with him and send him the book. And IFRA as well still has different programs or projects, and especially a translation that's going on of a book that Mudimbe wrote in French, and which is currently being translated, and that's going to be published in quite some time. And we were in conversation with his wife, and because about they have the rights and so on. So in discussion with the family, and we wanted Mudimbe to know about all this, and that we can talk to him. So the book is timely in a way, but at the same time, I have a feeling of great sadness as well about hearing about his passing. So it's with this sadness that I'm talking as well today. So there's an important thing that I want to mention about the journey to this book, and that it was initially conceived under a program that we'd called at IFRA. I was director at that time. We had called it Intellectuals from Africa and the Diaspora, How African Thinking About Africa is Being Reinvented Today. And in the program, actually, we had, the conception, the idea was that we talk about Mudimbe in Nairobi, in an English-speaking country, and especially we talk about Mudimbe's works written in French, because they are not well known in English-speaking countries. So in of course, because we organized this with the University of Nairobi and the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, the invention of Africa and the idea of Africa were the main books that we mentioned and talked about and referred to. But we talked as well about his literary works, and that was an important dimension of it. And so bringing his work in French in an English-speaking country like Kenya, and the other part of the program, in which we did actually, was bring Ngugi wa Thiong'o in DRC. And we organized an event in Goma discussing Ngugi thought about what does it mean to decolonize knowledge, and especially what he says about the importance of using African language and write in African languages, and which we brought as well to open questions about translation, perhaps translating languages, so not just use one language, but the capacity of moving from one language to another, of mixing languages, and of speaking different languages. In a way, for example, which Bashir Diagne is telling us today about the importance of translation. Also, just do not stick to one language, but be able to use yourself different languages. And what we realized at that time is that actually in DRC, Ngugi is not so well known. And so the program, the horizon of the program is try to, at our level of course, but destroy a bit this barrier, this obstacle that cuts across Africa, between the French-speaking Africa and the English-speaking Africa. And authors are as major, as eminent as Mudimbe. His literary work in French is not so known. And the opposite as well, like an eminent author like Ngugi is not well known in French-speaking Africa. So that was the grounding of the program, and this worked quite well. There is as well, and it's something that was very striking for us, that Edward Said is so much mentioned, and for a right purpose, for a right reason. And at the same time, but Mudimbe wrote at about the same time, and showing exactly the same thing that Edward Said showed us, that the Orient, the Middle East, was built, was conceived. The idea of the Middle East is an exogenous, asymmetrical, essentializing thinking of extreme violence that was built during colonization, even before. And that was the same with Africa, and this is exactly what Mudimbe demonstrates. But Edward Said is so much mentioned and referred to, and Mudimbe is not so much. He is a bit, but sometimes in passing, or in African studies, yes. But if you open a little bit in the globalized, let's say, academia, well, is not so much mentioned. So this was, in the sense, the book, in that sense, is a tribute, or is a way to shed light on the importance of his work, because he is worthy of mention as much as Edward Said, for example. And perhaps this division as well reflects, again, about this subalternizing of Africa, even in academia. The fact that Mudimbe is not so much mentioned is that what has been proved and showed about Africa is as if the global academia doesn't really care about so much. So to us, it was it's something that needs to be sorted somehow. So at the core of our introduction is this notion that's very, very central to his work, the fact that through the work of the colonizers, through all this knowledge production during colonial times, an epistemic cage has been built, and in which people are trapped, people are enclosed. So Mudimbe's work is exactly showing how this epistemic cage was built, what kinds of work, how this knowledge circulated, how people borrowed from the others to say exactly the same thing and then essentialize even more, racialize even more. So this, the invention of Africa and the idea of Africa are really about showing, revealing this epistemic cage. But through, as well, cutting across this revelation of this epistemic cage comes the question of now, what do we do? And this is the way this discussion was built today. Now, what do we do when we know that there is an epistemic cage? An epistemic cage in which Africans are enclosed, or African minds are enclosed, but as well with the mind of Europeans, the mind of the Americans, that we are all enclosed in this epistemic cage. So how do we think?
If I could just ask at this point, so do you think that this book has broken out of that cage?
This one, this book? I think the different authors are trying to give us options, ideas, thinking about how to break it. Yes, and indeed, because so Mudimbe says, okay, we have to think against this cage. We have to think outside of the cage, and he's telling us different things. We need to set up new questions about ourselves. We need to invent new conceptual tools. We need to have different theoretical, epistemological foundation, but these are very broad ideas. But how do you do this exactly? What are the practical tools that we can use? And this reflects a conference that took place 4 years after the invention of Africa was out. And the central question was asked by Paulin Hutonji at that time: what is to be done now? What is it to be done? So many, lots of scholars, and we know them, are publishing about what do we do now? How can we do it? And there are well-known figures: Achille Mbembe, Felwine Sarr. So there's a discussion by Kai Kresse in the book about the importance of Felwine Sarr today to give us some a path that we can follow, or ideas about what can be done. And the different authors as well are grasping and giving us some ideas of what can be done to find what Kai Kresse calls an African new epistemological locus. Find a locus to think by ourselves. It doesn't mean think only with our own tools, as if, for example, Europe had created nothing interesting, but just bring different tools together. What we have here, what may be interesting from other parts, and let's invent something new that's important for us and that speaks to us. So among some of the books, I don't want to be too long, but about some of the books that are mentioned here are books in French like L'autre face du royaume, L'odeur du père. L'odeur du père has been translated only in English only 40 years, only recently in 2022, 40 years after its publication, as The Scent of the Father. And his autobiography, Mudimbe's autobiography, Les corps glorieux des mots et des êtres, the glorious, so it hasn't been translated yet, the glorious bodies of words and beings. And actually in the book we selected a short extract about this biography in which Mudimbe explains the power of the mission of the missionary, because he went to the small seminary and was trained as a priest, and the power on his mind, on his subject, how it subjectivated him, and actually estranged him as well from his roots, from who it was from the beginning. So, and it's a very powerful reflection on the use of time, how the missionary controlled time in the seminar and controlled space as well. And through the control of time and space, this is your whole subject as well that is totally transformed. So there's this very telling extract that we decided to translate in English, so at least it's available, and which as well authors like Pierre-Philippe Fréture discusses in this chapter, and as well as Sami Balochi with Maëline Lelay. Sami is an artist from DRC, and all his art work is created using Mudimbe's work and thought. And there's perhaps a last, because we have about 10 minutes, I don't want to be too long, but in the we're trying to reflect a little bit on how we try to do this cooperation with the University of Nairobi and between IFRA, and what's a fair kind of cooperation. And this reflection was supported as well by Mudimbe's thinking about how can academic cooperation be fair and not asymmetrical. So we're trying to explain why we decided to mix philosophy and anthropology and literature and use a sort of undisciplined way of conceiving academia, why we mixed French speakers and English speakers, African-based scholars and European-based scholars, and trying to follow, and I'm going to read this as a closing sentence, Mudimbe's idea about. So he says, what could cooperation between Euro-American and African universities mean? The answer is simple. In my opinion, what matters is that African universities find their own path. This path should respond to the needs of the evolution and the authenticity of African societies. True inter-university cooperation can occur only within this framework and have three principal requirements: creativity, and an enduring spirit, and rigor. And he's expanding on this, but you can, if you want the rest of the quotation, you can read it. So I'm not saying we managed to have this fair and totally equal cooperation, but this is what we had in mind when we conceived this program and worked with the University of, and with especially the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Marie, I'm very curious. I'm glad you mentioned the excerpt in the book, which is Mudimbe's memoir. I'm very curious about why, from an editorial point of view, not so much why you picked that piece, because it's a very illuminating piece about his personality and his ideas and the becoming, but why you chose not to translate the title of that piece, because it's in French. And I found that curious. It's something to think about. But as you think about it, do you mind if Alex tells us about his chapter? Because we could talk about that a little more. Alex, thank you. Thank you for being here today. Well done on writing through COVID. Mudimbe, when most of us hear Mudimbe, we think philosophy, and some people even just walk away. Because philosophy, why would I bother? I am in history. Philosophy, why would I bother? I'm in geography. But here you are. Why does Mudimbe matter to literature?
Thank you very much, Joyce, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being here at IFRA once again. Maybe before I answer that question, why does Mudimbe matter to literature, I'd like to go back a bit. Mariot has mentioned about this symposium that took place in Goma, and then another one that was held at the Department of Philosophy. You may realize I'm not in the Department of Philosophy, right? I'm in the Department of Literature. But I happened to, travel to Goma for that program. I went there to talk about Ngugi. It was very interesting because we met a lot of young people out there in Goma who, as we've been told, did not know much about Ngugi's works. Just like here, we've not read Mudimbe because he's not been translated into English. Yet, the works of Mudimbe are just as important as Ngugi's works are in Kenya because he's taught at the high school level. His texts are classic texts out there. But there was this feeling, you know, the youth out there, when we were talking about Ngugi, they were saying, wow, this is someone we can relate to. He's speaking in our currency, etc., etc. And then the thing that struck me the most was that out there in Goma, you know, it's a Francophone country. So, of course, that's why there's this barrier. Of course, Ngugi has been translated into French, but there's that language barrier. However, they do speak Kiswahili, you know, even if it's a French kind of Kiswahili, but they do speak Kiswahili, and we could communicate directly at that level, you know, and that is what I wanted to bring out, that Africa, the barriers in Africa are linguistic barriers from outside, because somehow, if somebody from Nairobi can land in Goma and still communicate with that person at the informal level, why is it that we cannot communicate at the formal level, you know? And another thing is that when I landed in France, when I went there to study, my first day, I was walking around. I thought I'd land on campus and have a desk waiting for me, like happens here. But there was nothing. So finally, I was so hungry, I said, let me go to the mess. At least I'll buy food. But when I got there, I discovered people don't even use money. They're using tickets to buy their food. So at that point, I just gave up and said, okay, I'm done. But an African now, my fellow African came, spoke to me in rapid French. I couldn't understand him. I responded in English. He couldn't understand me. And he asked me, where are you from? I told him Kenya. He said, ndugu, umeingia mahali kuna shida sana. So suddenly we were communicating because he was from Goma. So you see, that language thing at that level, how it's helpful. So that should mark our entry point into trying to understand Mudimbe, because Mudimbe is telling us to move from that elevated platform, those things that bring us apart, and go to the basics where our Africanness remains. You know, Mudimbe is very complicated. Reading him, as everybody says, he quotes everything from Greek philosophers, Latin, but what I've just tried to explain would be in a very simple manner what he's saying, that let's go back to the fundamental basics. Let's use that popular level and speak to each other. That way our barriers will be erased. So coming back to this, I happened to wander into that philosophy seminar, and I was quite intrigued by Kai Kress's presentation at the time. Kai Kress is a good friend of mine. He works in anthropology, philosophy, and literature. So he was talking about Mudimbe's take, and it struck me, and I was saying, yes, this is Foucault, this is Said, just like we're being told. And he said, yeah, it's the same thing, but this is Mudimbe. And as Mariot has told us, it seems like there's a silencing of African critics. We can speak about Spivak, can speak about Said, but Mudimbe has done the same thing. How come we are not privileging him? So it was from that point that I thought, okay, why don't you delve deeper? Why don't you try and do some research into the work of Mudimbe? And I was encouraged by Mariot, Salim, and Mylene, who told me, okay, send us a chapter on this. So I was thrown into the deep end. I don't know, I just, I do not know much about philosophy, although I realized when I was in France that it's a very important part of their studies. You study philosophy even in high school. So I had to kind of delve into it more seriously. But at this point in time, I really had to start working on this philosophical text that is Mudimbe's work.
He used a particular concept that Mudimbe has applied.
Yes.
To read Goge and Grace Accord.
Yes.
Why that particular concept? Sorry, in my spontaneity, I messed up the people who were trying to record. I apologize. But I just wanted to throw you back to your chapter, deep into your chapter, because you didn't just use Mudimbe, in that general sense, but you were very particular in picking a particular concept in his argument, gnosis, and if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, Mudimbe talks about, the essentializing of Africa, the creating of Africa in discourse over the years, in that the African has been othered. And I think he's building on the work of the likes of Hutonji, who talks about extraversion. And he talks about ethno-philosophy and such concepts. And then he looks at the whole spectrum of philosophy and says, whereas some philosophers want to traditionalize Africa, there are others who want to use Western tenets of philosophy to understand African society. So these two extremes are the wrong approach to understanding Africa. So there is one that is more in the center, which is based on Foucault's work of the archaeology of knowledge, where you don't privilege some knowledge over other forms of knowledge. There's this tendency to talk about rationality as being transcendental, the central signifier, and irrationality as being, something primitive. And I think that is what African studies have suffered from, because I even detest, I've talked about it in conferences, when we talk about Africa and Africans and their beliefs, we have this term animism that dismisses our cultural beliefs. It's just say animism and then superstition, and then you forget about it and move on to the Western kind of approaches. But Mudimbe now comes with a more central approach, and he talks about an African gnosis, a way of studying knowledge in Africa that is not based on an epistemic knowledge or a doxa. It's just a gnosis, because you're out there trying to find out. It's heuristic. It's something that you do on the take. You find out what is there and you accept it. Is it African? Does it teach us something? And then you take it up. So that's basically that's why I try and use this approach of trying to delve into Kenyan literature to see whether there's an African gnosis that is evident from that text. And I think Mudimbe refers to it as la chose du texte, which means that thing that is within the text. And if you go back to Foucault, you'll see that Foucault says that power relationships underlie texts. So that is the whole gamut that we're trying to bring out there.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if there's a particular question from the floor at this point for this panel. Anybody with something burning? Yeah, sure. Wait for the mic.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask, did Mudimbe ever write in an African language?
I don't think so. I may have missed something, but I don't think so.
No, Mudimbe only writes in French and English. And one of the critiques against Mudimbe probably is that he said not to practice what he preaches. But on the other hand, I think Kai Kress explains this very well. He says that he tries to point the way forward. It's not up to him to finish work. he has done it well enough by just showing you that this is where you need to head towards.
I just want to follow up with that issue, because we have to understand Mudimbe's context. The fact that he's extracted, in a sense, from his community and put in that cage, and which is about time and space, which Marie talked about in the seminary, basically. And then he continues with education in Europe and so on. So again, understanding the context that complicates his ability to write in an African language would be very, very important. So that even as we challenge the fact that he didn't write in an African language, to appreciate the complexity of the space that he occupied, and to celebrate the idea fundamentally. I think this is something that we need to continue reflecting on. What are those complex situations in which authors find themselves, and scholars find themselves, and how can those complex situations excuse them, in quotes, of course, from the lapses that we encounter?
As Garnet, you can take the mic to Garnet. As Garnet is thinking up that question, I'm really struck by that idea. Can you think African in a non-African language? Which kind of brings us to the question of which one is an African language anyway? These ones that have been on the continent for the last however many years, have we not owned them yet, regardless of the circumstances upon which they were imposed on us?
Okay. And I think to answer that, I'd just quote Taye Selassie, and she says, "My English is an African language." She totally just owns it. So I just took off from there. But one of the things that really excites me about Mudimbe, being an English-speaking African, I don't want to call myself Anglophone, is that he actually writes in English and French. And so, for me, some of his philosophical ideas, that I could access them directly from him in English already. But looking at, and I just had a very, very small look at the book last night. And on page 109, he was talking about one of the areas called Kapoloe. And he said when the missionary first came in, he had to learn Bemba to come and speak to the local people. And then after a little time, the same community are speaking Kiswahili. After a little while, the same community are speaking in Lingala. And and so forth. So for me, in terms of his receptiveness to language, even though he only writes in English and French, his receptiveness to language and what he hears and what he translates for us in his philosophy, I think that is what I take, that he does have a facility with language because of his context. And for me, that's such a powerful thing. Yeah, thank you.
Also, especially, I think his books as well is an effort to convince an academic community about this idea that Africa is an idea constructed through colonialism. He wanted to convince people, and so he wanted his text as well to be accessible to the Europeans, to the Americans. We can directly read him and understand what he wants to say. So the effort as well is in language for dissemination, and that where the language he mastered, but as well the language through which he could speak to a certain audience he wanted to convince about his ideas. I don't know if you get my point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think one of the most powerful things about the excerpt of his memoir here is the way he demonstrates this through this idea of space. And Michel Desato's walking the city, and shows how that construction of the colonized space comes about in complete contrast. Really doing some important work there in cultural geographies in terms of how people make places, but also how those places then begin to make the people what is that transformation that takes place. So it's a beautiful excerpt. I felt a bit excluded because you chose not to translate the title of it, but I'll figure it out thanks to ChatGPT.
Can I say something? Okay. I just want to continue on this question of language vis-a-vis Mudimbe's take. And I'll just say that when I talk about la chose du texte, it's not just as simple as writing in African languages, which is one thing I discovered when I was carrying out my critical analysis. Because you'll find that most African writers have what Spivak calls a double take. You know, you are educated in the Western sense of education. So even if you go back, like Ngugi does in his writing of Matigari, if you say, I'm going to write in a local language, and then you go ahead and do it, you know, and it's also evident in the works of philosophers who are kind of looking for a retraditionalization of Africa. But Ngugi's Matigari uses a lot of biblical allusion. It also, you know, talks about class structures in society. So even if it's written in Gikuyu, if we read it using the prism provided by Mudimbe, we realize that it does not offer us that African gnosis. It does not have that la chose du texte. So that is one of the findings, you know, I came across during my research. So we can't say that simply falling back on African languages and expressing them, ourselves in them, is a solution per se. It's more nuanced and complicated than that.
I'm sure there are questions, but I'll ask you to hang on to them so that we listen to the other panel, be very fair to the other panel that's coming up. And as I do that, the person chairing that panel is our friend Kimani Njogu. So I'll be very provocative and say that one of the conclusions that this panel here has drawn is that there is more to African languages than linguistics. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Joyce. Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Marie.
Oh, and please, a big clap.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I have the pleasure of, really moderating a panel that includes my teacher, Professor Mahad Bakari. Karibu Mwalimu. Welcome. And my other colleague, teacher, Zain Abubakar. And my other teacher, colleague, Garnet Olunya. Yes, and I'll actually pick it from Joyce's provocation. You see, linguistics is the science of language. And these matters are beyond linguistics. They are, but if you take language, broadly, and I think Walimu, we can discuss this a little further later. If you take language as existing in every single space, whether it's in politics, whether it is in philosophy, whether it's... these matters are actually about language, in a sense. Therefore, they are beyond linguistics, but they are actually about language. And I want to start with Mudimbe and the application of his ideas in real life. We have seen a little bit of the application of the ideas in African studies. I think there was an effort to reflect on that in the first panel, in terms of the audience being a Western audience and therefore writing in English to be able to articulate a different perspective to the way knowledge was being disseminated in the global north, knowledge about Africa and so on, and the need to do a subversion of the ways in which it was being disseminated in academy. I want to start with you, Zain, and here to reflect on the question of culture, because if you look at Mudimbe's writing, he really wants to encourage us to look at the complexities of the continent of Africa. And one of the ways in which we appreciate that complexity is looking at the various cultures, the various languages, the various experiences on the continent. And I want to ask you, with reference to the Constitution of Kenya, and the ways in which, as one of the people who were involved in writing the Constitution, the ways in which culture becomes a central pillar of the Constitution in terms of its architecture. Do you see that effort of integrating culture more deliberately in the Constitution as an advancement or an application of Mudimbe's philosophy? Do you see an intersection between the culture, the Constitution of Kenya, and Mudimbe's philosophy? If you could do that, I know there is so much to say, but because of time, if you can do that briefly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chair, elder, distinguished participants. I feel what Bob Marley sang about, saying so much things to say right now and so little time. But I'll just try and focus on one aspect of the Constitution for today. But Prof, absolutely. My answer is absolutely. So I'll start with a conversation we had before the formal constitution-making process began with the late Professor Osaga Odak. And Professor Osaga Odak, what he was asked to speak to us about was, is it possible to write a constitution based on African philosophy and African perspectives? And his answer was yes. And we went into great detail about how that could be done. So I'm going to try to be precise for that 10 minutes. And I was thinking last night, what is the best way to showcase these ideas of and intersection between the ideas of Mudimbe and others with our constitution-making process? And I chose to talk about land and environment. So we deliberately took the position that the opportunity to make a constitution under independence, an independence context, was also an opportunity to deconstruct our past, understand our present, and to imagine a different future for us. So apart from this cage, there's an insidious part of that cage that Mudimbe talks about that has to do with killing knowledge and killing existing structures that the European found. Why did I choose land? Because we as Kenyans have a particular history. Some people call the concept of settler colonialism. So in terms of understanding that, is we were very great. We were very as a team that was involved in the constitution making, we were very privileged to have among us the late Professor Okoth Ogendo. So I'll talk a little bit about that deconstruction and conceptualization. So we came from the premise of a land tenure and a land architecture and ownership architecture in our country based on certain European assumptions vis-a-vis the reality of local people. So I'll talk about summaries, high-end. I'm sorry because of the time limitations. So the first one has to do with can there be communal ownership? The answer by the European architecture was no. You could not have communal ownership. What they were prescribing for us was, one, establishing exclusive rights to own land mainly by individual, in private hands. Two, to maximize profit out of that land. Three, to include a new concept that maximization of profit was not part of our architecture and our thinking and our value base and our philosophy. But also the other one which they introduced was speculation. So that you could have learned as a mechanism for speculation. That was very foreign to most of our communities. But also more importantly, the idea that, one, a community cannot have a concept of owning land. Two, that the community cannot be so sophisticated and advanced that they can have the responsibility of owning land. You know how outrageous that sounds? But that was the philosophy, that was the thinking. And the thinking was that because these people are incapable of owning land or even having what you call juridical capacity, right? Then they must be helped to manage that land on their behalf. And this foolish idea about trusteeship, that we hold this land in trust for you, and we'll do what is best for you. So they could not understand that you could not have a conceptualization of an individualization of owning land into perpetuity. There's no such concept among African people at that philosophical level, right? You could have access, you could use it, you could manage it, but there is 5 principles that we tried to put in our constitution, which has to do with our philosophy, generally speaking, and our values. Number 1, that there is a higher ideal of relating to land that binds, in a cosmological way, communities. Meaning what? In simple terms, that the current generation has a responsibility to future generations, so that you cannot utilize the land the way you like and jeopardizing the commitment to future generations. That conceptualization is also have a relationship to even when somebody dies. So this idea, there was some debate that, you know, in the future land will be so scarce, we should cremate people when they die. There are those who have that background, they can go on and do that, but there is a foundational religious-based approach where they say, even the people who are dead must have preservation of their land rights, including a place to rest, if you like. Okay? Secondly, that in conceptualization of ownership, we need to address the excesses and the punitive aspects of the land grab that became part of our history, right? And I know many settler communities have done that, and they have had backlash from modern day colonialists, including in Zimbabwe and so on and so forth. In Algeria, they were a bit lucky because most of the collaborators went with the French. Excuse my French. So that aspect had to be handled. So we were in a situation where we were being told there are some people, individuals, mainly foreigners, who owned land for about 1,000 years. 1,000 years. They had a lease for about 1,000 years. Can you imagine that? So we said, okay, how do we do it? And we learn from the other Africans that we did. So after many people haggled back and forth, some of the elite consensus people were completely against this idea, but we managed to say leasehold land in Kenya can only be held for 100 years. And there's a reason why 100 years. Because most of those leaseholds will have come to an end during our lifetime. So we will have an opportunity. I'll talk about this at the end. Thirdly, in terms of designation of land, so we said you could only have private land in Kenya, reluctantly. You could have public land, and you could have community land, right? There was no crown reference, none of those all of that was deconstructed. So what did we conceptualize community land as? Partly based on its ethnic identity and based on the common practice of the people. That's why now that land is supposed to go back to communities, right? And then public land, there is no such thing as government land. I keep on hearing people say, this housing projects is being held at government land. There's no such conceptualization now about government land. So, Prof, before you tell me so much things to say right now, I'm going to say two last things, right, concerning land. There was a legitimate expectation that will move from constitution making to constitutional building. And in this constitutional building process, we will then provide the mechanisms for making sure that the land transformative agenda in the Constitution comes alive. Some of us wanted to put the detail in the Constitution. And those who come from the common law tradition said, no, you don't do that. Constitution's about principles. And then the parliament shall enact legislation to give life to the constitutional principles. Now you can imagine. I know people are smiling. They're imagining our members of parliament. And I'm not about to abuse them. I'm just saying we know what we know. All right? And then lastly, Mr. Chairman, I think in my experience, there's only, and I will stand to be corrected, there's only one work that has looked at the philosophical and value imperatives of making the Kenya Constitution. And it is written by Dr. Mutaha Kangu. But he has limited himself to explaining the devolved system of government. What am I saying? There is room, there is a demand, and there is an obligation on all of us to look at the cultural imperatives in our Constitution. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. So that's a live example of the utility of Mudimbe's provocation, in a sense, saying, look, we cannot depend on the Western knowledge sources to understand Africa. That land in Africa is political, it's economic, it is social, it is cultural, it is spiritual, it is all these things. And that if you use the Western lens, you'll not be able to appreciate these aspects of Africa. And therefore, in the making of the constitution, of African constitutions, and many African countries are going to be doing this, it's really critical that they move away from the prism of the Western, constitution-making process and so on, and to imagine something different. So I come to Garnet Oluoch Olunya. And again, I'm moving to the application of this, of Mudimbe's thinking. And I want to go back to an idea that the director, IFRA, Ricard Sylvian, mentioned in his opening remarks related to co-publishing and the work, the collaborations, and I want you to reflect with me on, for example, the work we do at Twaweza, producing Jahazi, which intersects academia and practice, people in the practice of creativity and so on, and people who are based in the university. So reflect a little bit on Jahazi, and also reflect a little bit on this ability for an institution such as Twaweza, which is not strictly speaking a publishing house. You know, it is an arts, culture, and media institution committed to social justice and transformation of societies and so on. But on the side, produces and co-publishes with an institution like IFRA, which is really a research institution, you know, making possible. So knowledge production, knowledge dissemination, and these type of collaborations. To what extent can you say that we are, in a sense, practicing what Mudimbe articulates in his writings, the idea of Africa, invention of Africa, and in other places where he has actually written? To what extent are we doing this in practice?
Wow, thank you. I think first I want to remind us what Kimani actually said at the beginning when he was introducing Twaweza, and he said that Mudimbe visited the institution. And I remember at that point, the idea of philosophy, you know, as something really difficult and inaccessible, and of course the writings of somebody like Mudimbe, you know, for me that was kind of huge in my mind. And then we spent an afternoon with V.Y Mudimbe in, you know, very close proximity in our usual boardroom, and we had a wonderful time. And suddenly, even for me, you know, the whole idea of what we were doing, which was looking at African knowledges, trying to make it accessible to ourselves, from ourselves, that became not just, you know, Kenyan, but also Pan-African, because here was this man who had sought us out to come and have a chat and just see, you know, what are we thinking about Africa? What are we thinking about ourselves? What are we thinking about knowledge going forward? What are we thinking about anchoring ourselves within our own continent and our own spaces? And so for me, that was really, really special. And of course, like I said earlier, you know, this whole idea of, you know, him coming from a different place, you know, that French-speaking place, that Franco, which had, you know, as he said, been defined by somebody else. And so, you know, also coming from primary languages, which we all come from. You know, what do all these things mean in terms of constituting our identity? And so for me, that was a very powerful meeting. But just going back to Jahazi and how we came to, and this Jahazi is out there for those who haven't seen it. This is the journal that we produce, and we've been working at it for quite a while now with Prof and other teams as we've gone along. And you know, I was
just to mention, that's available online, downloadable, and so on and so forth.
Oh, wonderful. I didn't want to plug it, but here we go. Okay. And so, you know, we were thinking about, you know, when we started thinking about Jahazi, we were thinking about how to start or how to establish a platform that would be accessible to scholars, to artists, to practitioners on the ground. And, you know, we'd seen that there was kind of a divide between academia and, you know, and the practice. And, you know, both Prof and I actually met in academia. And so it was really, really important that, you know, knowledge is disseminated downwards, because why do you study so hard if you're not going to share that knowledge, and who's that knowledge for? And so we began to think about Jahazi, and for me, I like to place it in the literary tradition of, you know, journals like Black Orpheus, of journals like Présence Africaine, of journals like Transition. And, you know, the man who started Transition, Rajat Nioji, started it in East Africa, which we were in Uganda. And he said this of literary magazines. He said literary magazines in Africa are faced with burdens and responsibilities that their counterparts in other countries do not have to shoulder. And so we knew we had a responsibility, because what are we going to be putting out there in terms of communicating to these people? The other thing we reflected on was the fact that ideas matter. But it was also soon evident to us that funding also matters, okay? And, you know, this became clear from Transition's own story, where Rajat Nioji almost went crazy at one time when he found out that these free radical ideas that he was putting out were actually funded in a roundabout way through the Farfield Foundation by the CIA. So in other words, that there was, Big Brother looking down and, who pays the piper, calls the tune, almost in a sense directing, even though he was not aware that this was happening. So what did that mean? And that was done through the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And so, here we were thinking about, looking for money to put out this magazine. What would it mean? What foundations are available? And remembering that when Transition left Uganda and went to West Africa, because that's where it went first before it landed in Harvard, that Wole Soyinka was the first editor. And one of the first things that he did was to reject Ford Foundation money, which Rajat had worked so hard on securing, and he was livid, understandably so. But then for us again, here was Wole Soyinka, who of course is in my field because I'm a literary scholar, who had then said, I don't want to be confined in that orange ghetto. And of course the orange ghetto being, the African Writers series, Orange Books, that were what we had as African literature. So, some of these questions already, sitting on our heads, is even as we were thinking of how are we going to produce our journal. But for me, sharing again from Mudimbe, the fact that he actually sat on the advisory board of Transition once it went, to the United States. And so we have these threads running through, and that paper that Joyce referred to, that the editors failed to translate the title. He actually first published in Présence Africaine, which is again one of the journals that we were looking at, because it did provide one of the first platforms, for the articulation of ideas about Africa. Okay, so the second point I wanted to make today goes back a little in history. And I really love history. And this goes back to the invasion of Egypt by Napoleon. And we're all caught up now in the repatriation debate, and there was also references to repatriation in here, where in an interview with the artist, I think Mylene says, it's symbolic, the repatriation is symbolic. But, we're talking about artifacts here. But what I want to suggest this afternoon is that the main thing that Napoleon actually took out of Egypt was not those artifacts that, some which are still in the Louvre, which is of course also built in a pyramidal fashion, So, these are all signals of that connection with Africa. But that what he took, and he had carried an entire team of different scholars, archaeologists, geographers, you name it, literary scholars with him when he went into Egypt. They were defeated, spent 3 years there as prisoners, but what they did in that 3 years was gather knowledge. And it is this knowledge that they carried out and that has powered the initial machinery for the generation of knowledge, so-called Western knowledge, in places like France. And I want to bring up Cheikh Anta Diop, because he was one of those first scholars who questioned and decided to repatriate these ideas back to the continent. And of course, one of the first things that happened to him was he failed his PhD, which he was doing in France.
It's called the barrel of the pen.
Yes, the barrel of, absolutely. He failed. But he continued on and published these works. But even when he went back to Senegal, he was not recognized. He was not recognized because some of what he was suggesting was too revolutionary, that, these things start with us and that they are actually ours. Even the Leopold Sédar Senghor sidelined him for many years. Okay, so it's in, through UNESCO, through the project on the 8 volumes on African knowledge, and through such things that he's now being recovered. And just to say, even the CBC here is going to be looking at those books, so that's a really good thing. Then the third thing I wanted to talk about is our relationship with languages. And I think because you had mentioned, you know, Ngugi. And one of the things that Ngugi has said in one of his last works, The Language of Languages, is that the language of languages is translation. And so for me, I actually do want to thank you for having the translations in this book, because I'm actually able to read some of the stuff I had not had access to before. And it's actually really giving me a more rounded understanding of Mudimbe and where he comes from. So thank you for that. But then, just locally, because of course we happen to be in Nairobi and we happen to be in Kenya, I wanted us to reflect back to the 1930s. And we have Louis Leakey, who went to do, I think it was his master's in Cambridge. And remember, Kenyatta was over there as well, writing, facing Mount Kenya, doing his master's in SOAS. And one of the things that Louis Leakey did was, when he was asked to register his languages for his examination, for his defense, for his oral examination, he put down his languages, and they were Gikuyu, they were Kiswahili, and they were English. And so when he did finish, and he was writing about the Gikuyu, was that they actually looked for an elder knowledgeable in the tradition as an examiner. And so why are we so afraid of our own languages? That's the thing I keep asking. Like, other people can appropriate our languages and do things with them. But we really, I feel, are scared of our own languages. And the beauty here with this book is that Mudimbe actually talks about, you know, the tribalism that separates the people in the Congo, whether you have it through the naming of those streets that Joyce talked about, Ru, whatever, Ru, the name of the tribe. So even as, you know, like he talks about the new modernism, as they're trying to come together, they're unable to, because the sign at the beginning of the street says, the Kamba live here, you know? So these are some of the beauties of this book, and I think I'll leave it there because I can see you wanting to call the next guy.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely, Garnet, really. Again, the application of Mudimbe's thinking, you know, across the continent at so many levels, even when that application is not articulated openly as a Mudimbe influence, that these ideas are germinating at different points, at different, you know, spaces and so on, and being pushed forward. In fact, some of those ideas, some of those efforts predate Mudimbe, you know, and that he was also writing and standing on the shoulders of other people who had actually reflected on this. And I now come to my teacher, you know. Mwalimu taught me linguistics at the University of Nairobi in the 1980s, and education theater, and I continue learning from him. And so, Mwalimu, I want you to reflect with me, because Mudimbe wrote to show the poverty of knowledge in the Western academy, when that academy ignores, you know, sites of knowledge production from Africa, for example, and sites of knowledge from other domains of life. And so his audience is just basically challenging, you know, the global north, like, you know, you guys are poorer for not, you know, looking at these other sites of knowledge, and therefore, to become better, you need to go where other knowledge sources are. If you can just reflect with me on what is it that we miss when we don't reach out to philosophies located elsewhere, philosophies located in Africa, philosophies located in Asia, philosophies located in South America. How poor do we become? Big question, only 10 minutes, Prof. You can use the mic because, yeah.
Thank you very much, Mwalimu. This is a large question, as you rightly put it. But there have been a lot of scholars actually who had paid attention to this issue. And the assumption is that it's only the West that has a canon, that you can't find, other communities, other societies are not really capable of having anything that we can call a canon. A canon is actually a rarefied collection of works that are highly regarded for different reasons. And it was assumed that this is not something that you can find in non-Western societies. It is something that only belongs to the West. And there are people who are almost violently opposed to any idea of a non-Western society having a canon. And the classic example is that of Alan Bloom. Alan Bloom is notorious for saying that you can't have a canon in other cultures and other traditions, but that has been challenged. And I have a very interesting book here called "The Eastern Canon," which reminds the West that, in fact, there are canonical works in non-European languages and cultures, and much, much older. It's only that you are ignorant about them. And so that has led to debates, to and fro between those who support Alan Bloom or the Alan Bloom camp, and those who argue that there are richer, even more vibrant canons in non-Western societies. And in fact, there's not one canon. There are multiple canons. So if you look at the Chinese, for example, you look at the Japanese, you look at the Islamic tradition, there are multiple canonical works that are judged canonical because of the aesthetic nature of those works. And you can use more or less the same kind of criteria, to judge these works as those that are used to bring in the Western canon. So this is something that had been going on actually for a very long time. And you'll find very useful examples, in this. This is available, in my personal library, and people can always come and borrow it if you belong to our book club.
And the book club is called Wasomi Africa.
Wasomi Africa.
Wasomi Africa, I would highly, highly recommend.
Yeah. In fact, it's not only this volume, but there have been other scholars who also have been defending the idea of canonical works. And I think the other very, very important thinker is Amitav Ghosh, who studied, is an Indian scholar at Oxford, who studied Arabic and looked at these canons, and he said these canons are a lot richer than those actually found in the West. It's only that these people have not been beating drums, to say that they have the superior canons too. And then it's not only the prosaic, but also the literary canons. And here we have a very good example of these canonical works. For example, Vishnu's crowded temple that looks at some of these works. And again, we have the work of Makers of Modern India by Ramachandra Guha. Again, he comes and discusses the same issue about the richness of the vast Indian scene and Indian literature. That is not, in fact, there's not one Indian literature. There are multiple thousands of literatures in that society. So you cannot compare, the Western canon with these other equally vibrant and important canons. And the most vociferous critic of the idea that non-Western societies don't have canonical works is, of course, Pankaj Mishra in his very, very exciting, provocative, and controversial work from the ruins of empire. Yeah. So I would strongly suggest that we go and have a look at some of these works. And the literary, foremost literary novel that addresses this issue is that by Yumpa Lahiri. It's called Unaccustomed Earth. So I just brought this so that we familiarize ourselves with the realities on the ground. It's not enough, to just listen. I urge people to actually go and read these works, and they are spellbinding. You don't expect these kinds of things. You'd think they are dry, but in fact they aren't. They are extremely exciting to go through. And that's just about what I have to say.
Absolutely, Prof. Thank you so much, really. Again, going back to the need to make reference to other sources of knowledge and not restrict ourselves to that which we have around us, and to read, cultures in their complexity, in their multiplicity, and so on, and that wherever human beings are located, they will be producing knowledge. Of course, there is a challenge of linguistic access, and that's how translation now becomes really critical, because the way we access now, those knowledge sources is through translation in certain cases, and that's why the investment in translation is really key. I would like now to open up a little for interaction, questions, comments, reflections, advancements of some statements that have been made. Anybody with a comment, question, reaction, reflection? Yes, Sylvian. Yeah. Can you use that?
Thank you so much for this very wonderful presentation. And I'd like to address you a question, because us, our publishers, we sometimes are experiencing this kind of domination. I mean, which is called international academic standards and norms. So sometimes us, when we receive some papers, we feel sometimes uncomfortable now to tell to the author, no, you have not fulfilled this norm, this request, so out, which is very violent. And we feel, we do not feel comfortable, but in the name of the excellency of the journal, we have to fulfill. So it's a kind of, I'd like to ask, how do you deal yourself with this kind of contradictions?
Well, that's a very good question, actually. And I will respond a little bit, and then I will hand over to my colleagues. The way, for example, we publish is that we publish both academicians as well as non-academicians. In many cases, we will ask, and we have one of the editors of Jahazi, for example, Dr. Muthuma here. We will, in fact, sometimes interview non-academicians, but write the story, but give them the byline as the authors, because they authored through the spoken word, you know. And the navigation of the academic terrain and the requirements of referencing styles, Chicago referencing style, MLA, APA, all those type of things, we sometimes suspend that, really. And we have to do that. We have to decolonize the publishing space by subverting some of those canonical requirements and accommodating other ways of telling the narrative. So from Taweza Communications, we have navigated this by being rebellious when we need to be rebellious, and being conservative when we need to be conservative. So certain books will tend to address the academy, others will be outside the academic canon. And I know that we have had this discussion with Dr. Fred Mbogo, for example, on the question of referencing and so on, and other writers. And he has also been rebelling against the canonical approach. Ganet, do you want to respond to this? Yeah.
Yes, I do have something to say. But before I do this, I wanted to just comment on the idea of cross-publishing, because I don't think I said much about it. But for me, one of the beauties of this cross-publishing is that I was able to access this book immediately. There was a time we used to wait for books that have been published in the West, and by the time it comes, you're like, I mean, that's even before Amazon and all that. So, because we go back away. So this was beautiful. I called Taweza and they said, yes, we'll send a rider, and I had it yesterday. So that for me, that was, access has totally changed things. So thank you again for this enterprise. And then the second one is what you're talking about, the whole question of peer review. And this we discussed for a long time before we established Jahazi. Who are the peers? Who are these people who are sitting over your head as you write your article and, like you're saying, very violently deciding that this is not up to the standard? And then that brings up the question, who are you writing for? And so these are some of the questions we really had to ask ourselves. If we want to advance knowledge over here first, how are we going to do it? But then again, I gave you that example of Leakey in Cambridge, which of course, as a colonial country emerging, we were told Cambridge, Oxford, those are the standards. Leakey carried his Gikuyu elder, who was the authority on the work that he was doing, and it was acceptable. So why don't we, or didn't we, take up that same spirit? Why do we go back rather than forward? Of course, as colonized people, I'd say. But the other thing that also came up, and I'll just use this opportunity to address it, was Edward Said, because you said Edward Said is normally cited. And I wanted to say, I'm a post-colonial scholar as well, and when I was studying in the 80s, Said, Spivak, and Homi Bhabha emerged out of the scholarship at the time as the main articulators of the thing we were groping towards understanding. And Edward Said used Orientalism to totally, throw open that area, which we then also went into and used the same, kind of framework to look at other things. Spivak the same with, the Indian subcontinent. So these are, it's also very specific. Even as, it's open, it's also very specific. So they emerged out of that period of, exploration. Thank you.
Yeah, with Said emerging with culture and imperialism and Orientalism, of course, and all the other. But of course, there is Frantz Fanon also, coming from the wretched of the earth, and so on. And again, accessing him through translation into Kiswahili, all the way to Kiswahili. Mwalimu, how do you navigate this space of, how do you make works accessible without the academy making it so difficult for us to publish?
Yeah. I think the irony is that those who wrote what have come to be canonical works actually wrote for ordinary people. They were not written for scholars. And it was the so-called scholars, who came to complicate and muddy the waters, But if you read any of these classical works, whether it is Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Politics, the language is so simple. It's meant for ordinary people. But it's these scholars, who came to create a cottage industry for themselves.
Absolutely. And it reminds me. It actually reminds me of a workshop we had. What's this hotel on University Way? Between academia and creatives. We were trying to find a way, when we were setting up Jahazi, Lilian Towers, we were trying to encourage practitioners to publish alongside academicians, and academicians to publish alongside artists. And I can tell you the tension in the meeting room was intense. How can we as academicians publish with guys from Okuru Kwajenga, and so on? And the artists were saying, the problem with these academicians is that they will try to command us to create in a particular way, that our works of art must follow a certain theoretical model, and we don't want that, you see. And so, but we had a full day. For the first 3 hours, mutual suspicion, lots of tension. But by the end, it became possible for people to engage. And I remember finally artists saying, you mean there are scholars who actually feel us, who understand that we can create without their theories, and so on, and so on. So I think Sylviane, it can be done. I think it's just being very deliberate. Yeah, and then Wanjala will just comment.
And I think I was just going into the book. This is one question that I found in here. This is from Mylene, and she asks, just one more question to refocus on Mudimbe. I'm impressed, and it's interesting to see that an artist like you is working on Mudimbe, who is a thinker. And I got to that point and I stopped. And I thought, what the heck do artists do? They think. I mean, they express it differently, through the brush or whatever, but they think. Just like, the philosopher will express it in words. And so those questions are also contained in this book, is all I wanted to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, Wanjala.
Yeah, okay, let me play the devil's advocate here. I have a feeling that, practitioners are being bashed here unfairly. I think creative artists from whichever field are really free to do whatever they wish to do, you know. Recently, I was attending a conference. I got back last night in Washington for the College Language Association of the US. And, you know, they were complaining about how rap music and the other hip-hop culture exists. You know, you have people like Kendrick Lamar, who won a Pulitzer Prize, I think, was it last year or this year? But scholars cannot, you know, get publications out of these works because the canonic journals that exist say they cannot publish such texts. And yeah, so I asked them, yeah, you're complaining. Yes, there's this compartmentalization for African Americans. They're talking about they're being ethnicized, whereas the other cultures are mainstreamed. And I said, okay, we face the same problem in Africa because it's very hard for African scholars to publish about their works in these Western journals. However, you know, we can complain as much as we want to about being locked out, but you know, there needs to be a way. The artists are creating. They can't stop doing it. They'll create for their purposes of creativity, whether it's popular media, whatever, it's going on and on. However, we cannot straitjacket, as Mudimbe says, we cannot use Western theoretical approaches to study these texts, you know. So it's up to us, it behooves us as local critics to come up with theories and methodologies of understanding these texts and writing about them. So it's a give and take relationship. We cannot bash critics, and we cannot say that we are not allowing the creatives to continue creating. We can thrive together and move towards the future. And I think that is what Mudimbe tries to teach us also.
Absolutely, absolutely. Do you want to? Yeah.
Yeah. I would also like to play the devil's advocate here. Don't we think that sometimes we overpraise Mudimbe? Because you know, he's written this book, you know, The Idea of Africa, and there is also a wonderful book with the same title by Sunil Kilnani, The Idea of India. One of the most excellent books, you know, that you can really read. So I think we can't give Mudimbe, you know, all the kudos, you know, saying that you are an original thinker, you know, you have written the best books, and so on and so forth. I think we have to be a little bit critical.
And to push the discussion even further before I bring in Fred, is to think about Mudimbe, the idea of Africa, as a dialogic encounter with the idea of India, just as Arrow of God is a dialogic encounter with Arrow of Gold by Conrad, and so forth. So is it possible that this dialogic interaction is actually what makes us even better, and that even as we celebrate one, we are also celebrating the other? Maybe bring in Fred, then you'll come in. Yeah, Fred.
Thanks. I wanted to ask maybe this panel or the one before. It's a personal problem. Whenever I read authors, this is for your entertainment. Whenever I read authors who have first written in French, my favorite ones include Achille Mbembe. Yeah, they're rather difficult, and I struggle. I have to go to Wikipedia, then come back to the to the article and so on, and then I follow. So I'm wondering, on the scale of, I don't know what is Mudimbe this difficult? I mean, we were introduced to Mudimbe when we were undergraduates, and it seemed, well, you know, it's undergraduate notes, so the lecturer has already chewed them for you, so you sail on. So I'm just interested in that. I've met some people from Congo who actually read Mudimbe's work in their schools, high school. So I suspect it works for them. But how about the academic sort of engagement he has? Is he as difficult as Achille?
Maybe Marie can respond to that. Yeah, please.
Thank you for this question. I think in this volume, Thinking Africa with Mudimbe, you have two testimonies of how difficult actually reading Mudimbe is. One from Francis Owaka in the first chapter, explaining when Mudimbe was introduced in the curriculum by Dismas Masolo, and he was the first one, and how it was very difficult for the students in philosophy there to understand, and they had actually to go to and read Foucault now to understand Mudimbe better, so they had to go through different readings of other authors to be able to understand Mudimbe, and then actually that Masolo's work on Mudimbe as well was a sort of explanation of Mudimbe. And there's a second testimony that you may be interested in as well, is the chapter by Kai Kress, because there's several pages where he explained how much his students, perhaps, I don't know if it's his students when he was teaching in Colombia or in Germany, but it doesn't change much, find it so difficult to read a Mudimbe, and you really need a teacher and a professor to sort of let you in, Mudimbe's work, because indeed he has a very different writing. I don't know if it's specific of French speaking authors, but that's the case of perhaps we have a perhaps we love a sort of difficult writings because it gives a sense, and I guess it's what Mohamed, Professor Bakari was saying as well. A difficult language, or sort of gives the impression that the thinking is very, very interesting and very different from common sense language. So perhaps that's a sort of pretension as well. I don't know. Yeah. Lydia?
Lydia, yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. I think she wants to answer with me, the little one. You want to speak? No? Okay, all right. Anyway, I find that what we are discussing is, I don't have the right words for it. You see, every person is unique. Every person has their way of interacting with the world, phenomena, whatever you want to call it. So what happens is that much as every person is unique, every person also is cultured by a given community. And that's what they take with them. Without essentializing anything, we who have gone through Kenyan education, we tend to be very Anglophone. If we look at things and tell you about them, because here we are talking about forming the mind and the mind expressing itself. When it comes to expressing ourselves, simply because we fall back on the linguistics of English, we are brief, direct, to the point. Number 1, number 2, number 3, and you know that from the introduction, this is what will follow. Then my friend Foucault, who I find very difficult, I am like you, I found myself in France trying to do a PhD. Luckily, I didn't need language. Yes, yes. I didn't need language because I was looking at pictures. And I managed to get the president of the university, who was Italian, to allow me to write in English. Anyway, the Mediterranean languages, you go around in concentric circles. Then towards the end of the paragraph, you say what you are going to say. Mind you, the paragraph can be one sentence. In English, we don't do that. Then the beauty I find in Mudimbe, I haven't read Mudimbe much, I can't say I know him that well, but the beauty that I find is that he's trying to articulate who we have become. I am not a 19th century thinker. No, I am a 21st century thinker who has been trained to think like the English, to approach reality the way they do. But I can also fall back. There are some things, you know, that very intimate part of you, the creative part, when you're reacting to things. I'm a visual artist, an art historian. You don't need words. So I don't need to think in English, in French, or in Kikuyu. There's a way you mediate ideas without the use of words. And I think that's what Mudimbe is asking us to go back to, in which case the African of today has a very rich epistemology because we can rely on so many things. There are things that I can only express in a given language, or I can formulate the idea using parameters that are not, you know, these ones of school. The ideas that you mediate without school-going language. And I think, I could be mistaken, I think that's where Mudimbe wants us to go back to. That richness that we have, our mind has been formed like that because every Kenyan operates a minimum of 3 languages, a minimum of 3 cultures. Then when you want to express yourself, to give your message, it could spring from either of those 3 or only on one of those ones, etc. To give a brief example, with a colleague of mine, I was looking at a political meeting, which it ended up being political performance. Part of the speech was just rap. And this is somebody who goes to parliament and speaks correct English, wears a suit and tie. The sentences are clipped. Then this colleague of mine, who happens to be Fred Mbogo, is writing about the Hansard. The message that ends up in the Hansard is not what it's the same message he delivers outside, but for different purposes, with different levels of truth, with different. Mudimbe seems to be referring to that possibility of performing in different ways. If I'm asked to write for a journal, for Routledge, I'll do it their style, but I could also address my grandmother in Kikuyu land with the same ideas. It will mean a bit of work, but it's there, lying dormant. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So he's asking us, telling us to go to different places. We are now Mutuma, and then I'm saving you for last. I know. Do you want to do it now? Or let Mutuma do that.
I'll be very brief, and thank you thank you very much to the panel and the previous panel. I guess my question is, there's been mention of Edward Said, Frantz Fanon, Ngugi, as a kind of looking at their works together with that of Mudimbe, and how probably Mudimbe, at least in comparison to Edward Said and Frantz Fanon, probably doesn't get the same kind of visibility. And my question is whether Mudimbe is a political activist the way the rest are, because when I look at the politics of, the ideas of Said and Ngugi and Fanon, they also give their work visibility through their politics. And I don't know enough of Mudimbe's political life to comment on that. Maybe you can comment on whether his ideas also, he puts them into political action. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because it says whether his ideas are caged in the academy and whether they step out of the academy. Do you want to respond to, you had a response, eh?
Yes.
But we also need to respond to that question. Yeah.
Thank you, Chairperson. First, allow me to apologize. I told the chair of the panel that if we start on time, I'll leave by 4. So I beg your indulgence that when I speak, it's not rudeness. When you see me quietly with the permission of the chair, walk away. So let me start with the director's question in terms of academia and the restrictions of what is permissible, what is not permissible. To add to that conversation, I think it's the question of also demanding authorities. And who are these authorities? You know, you say you quote authorities in your paper or in your book, quote authorities. Who are these authorities? So if we go back to Mudimbe, these authorities mainly largely in the cage and Western in nature. The second one has to do with text. People talk about text. I come from the background of orature. So that has not been put on the table in terms of saying what is possible with orature, including performance. And you know, Ndugumbogo, the dilemma that Pibitek faced with his PhD, being an artist and being a scholar, and he never finished, according to the academy. But on your question, on the last question which he asked, it says, who is then responsible for breaking the chains? I suggest that it should be the academy in Africa and in other parts of the South, the global South. Because what justification in Kenya, for instance, 60 years after independence, that our academia does not allow for knowledge, and one of the biggest challenge, Director, in terms of the approach that has been used largely, is creation of new knowledge. So when you're working with creating knowledge, which authorities do you quote? Okay. So lastly, in terms of political, I would like to link my brother with what Professor said. But I would like to say that we need to look at Mudimbe's contribution within the larger framework of decolonization and decoloniality, a corpus of knowledge. Thank you very much, Chair. And I, again, apologize profusely that I have to sneak out because I have to make my other meeting. Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bakar Zain. Let's give him a clap for that so that he can... I was aware he's going for another meeting. Thank you so much, my brother. Yeah, as usual, yeah. We're now we're finishing, really. This was the time. And I know there was a hand, and I don't know whether we want to respond to Mutuma's question on whether there is a political dimension to Mudimbe's work. Do you want to do that? And then maybe you can make a very quick comment. Yeah.
Okay. I might not touch on the political, but one of the things that struck me about the philosophers coming out of the Congo was the role of the church and the highly philosophical kind of approaches that being in a seminary, for instance, or in that kind of Jesuit thinking that they come out with. And so for me, I think that has always been my main interest in the writing coming out of philosophers from that region, that the impacts of the church might be something that we do not think enough about, but the impacts of the ideas, and you can talk about impact from below, coming and shoring up other people's political ideas about what Africa means. Because sometimes influence might not be direct in that way. So for me, that's where I find that people like Mudimbe are really, really strong, that their ideas might impact in that other way. But just to broaden out a bit to your question on the hip hop and, how we are not doing this. I wanted again because I just have this in front of me, that the editor of this particular Jahazi, Professor Mwenda Mtarangwi, actually, Yes, he's actually, well, he's the Vice Chancellor of USIU right now, but he actually did his work on hip hop. And so, not long ago, I think it's 3 weeks ago, at the University of Nairobi, Professor Peter Wasamba did his inaugural, and somehow he roped in Giuliani to do, hip hop performance. So I was thinking, in terms of having the performance rather than the work within an academic text, that the artist is interacting in his area of expertise or performance with the academic text. So we can begin to look at it probably in that way. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll take one last comment question, and then we'll try to, we have to launch the book. So, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry. I don't know. The person who could have maybe responded to what I will ask, maybe the person who left, because he's the one who's trying to discuss culture in the writing of the Constitution, the intersectionality of that. I was just interested, trying to, I'm not a literary scholar, to understand Mudimbe. When I got to know he has passed on and all this, it was news to me. It's not something I knew, because then I'm not a literary scholar to have read his work. But my curiosity is on the side of how possibly we are trying to Africanize our constitution and the practice of constitutionalism here in Kenya with the translation of it. It was made in English, and many constitutions, if you buy it from the street, it's always in English, sponsored by different agencies, and they do the publication. I know there was some few Kiswahili during the time when there was public education that time. I don't know whether it was done in any mother tongue, Kikuyu or whichever. Maybe you can confirm from your communities. But then, how are we Africanizing this issue? Because culture is in the language. If our constitution is in English, then it means that is the culture in which we are speaking our constitution. It is the English culture, because it's still in English language. And so, maybe for those in Kiswahili, like in the coast, may benefit because they use Kiswahili, but those of us who speak our mother tongue, which is the third language, apart from English, Kiswahili, and Kiswahili, are we really realizing the dream of Mudimbe in thinking Africa when, if the language of our law is westernized, English and that?
I think the good news is that I was part of the team that was working on the language dimension to the Constitution of Kenya. And we did translate the Yashpal Guy and the Bomas draft. We did translate it into Kiswahili, and we pushed. I was working the team of 6, scholars and writers and people from other spaces, and we did that. We also did translate the COE draft, which again went out. The big struggle we have had is to eventually get an official version of the Kenyan Constitution. And I don't want to tell you how many letters I have written to the Attorney General. I don't want to tell you how much work we have, including writing to the President of the Supreme Court of Kenya on this question, So there has been a lot of work, but I can also tell you that part of the resistance to have these versions, the Constitution translated, is political. Because by translating, you make the Constitution start working, So by denying people access to the knowledge and their rights, you are able to contain power in a particular way. So it's political work. Other languages, we did translate the Bomas draft into Kenyan languages, and we played them in matatus and so on. So audiovisual versions of the Constitution of Kenya in the earlier days are available, and so on. And that was intellectual activism. If we could have we could talk about academicians working to democratize the country through this type of work. So, so the long and short of it, even as recently as 3 months ago, we did engage the Judicial Academy, you know, on this whole question. So the work has not stopped. It will continue. We don't have an official version of the Constitution of Kenya in Kiswahili or any of our languages, but we have not stopped work. We will continue doing this work and pushing it. We have to get to a point where we thank the panelists, for the first panel and second panel. And really to thank you for the amazing work, but we need to launch the book now. If I can call up front the editor, the director, if you can come and help us launch this. Formally, only him? I thought the editors and...
Marie.
Yeah, Marie, you have to come. And even the panelists, I think we need to be able to declare the book launch.
Yeah, definitely.
The panelists, Dr. Jason, yeah, it's just declaring the book. The panelists, the contributors. Yes, done it. Nice. Let's launch the book. Let's launch this book. And because of your camera, you have to declare it. You have to say it in words.
Okay.
You have to say it.
How long the speech?
No,
1, 2 hours?
Declare the book launched.
Okay, mabibi na mabwanas, waheshimiwa, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, we declare this wonderful book open. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Is there any other thing that we need to do after this? Is there a reception?
No, I think we can close that wonderful discussion and go for the tea. But once again, thank you everybody for your participation. Thanks again to Rosbell, of course, to IFRA's team, Marta, to all the panelists, everybody, the Tuaiza wonderful team. The discussion was very, very fruitful, and it reminds me a key word I've heard this morning listening to the media. Because Mudimbe's work is about domination. And this morning I've been told that in this country, in Kenya, we have flying shoes. So I'm wondering if it is a new species of bird or of whatever. And these flying shoes, they are called sometimes anarchist. I would like to correct this, you know. Anarchy is not chaos. Anarchy is order without hierarchy, which is very much different. So it's a way of challenging domination. Us, I think we don't like domination, any kind of domination, and we like tea right now. Okay, thank you.
Hello. She wants to take a photo of everybody holding a copy.
Okay.
Yeah. Mary is in media, and I have to obey. Yeah, thank you. Media, Mary, you guide us. Immaculate does. Immaculate, do you have an announcement to make?
Good evening, everyone. We have some books over there for sale. You can pass by that desk as you go for your tea.